Good morning, welcome to episode 3 of SAS From Scratch. Today we're going to be looking at libraries. We've already looked at them in episode 2. We saw, for example, that there's certain rules for naming your libraries. We've been making use of some of the built-in libraries that SAS provides us with. And today we're going to be creating our own libraries because that's more useful. You've probably gained some insight by now that we can't use these sample SAS datasets forever. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. I've got a few slides prepared. Let's remind ourselves what the definition is of a SAS library. It's a collection of one or more SAS files, including SAS datasets that are referenced and stored as a unit. Now, in a directory-based environment like Windows or Unix or even Mac, a SAS library is a group of SAS files that are stored in the same directory. So if you want to have a simple layman's reference to what a library is, it's kind of a reference to a folder. The one thing to keep in mind is that SAS will only show you things in that folder that are valid SAS files. And so what I mean by that is if you've got a folder, and we'll look at an example of this as well, but if you've got a folder that, for example, has an Excel file in there, and then there's a SAS dataset and a SAS formats catalog, if you look at that in the file browser, you will see all three files. If you map that folder to a library and you look at the library, you're only going to see the SAS dataset and the SAS formats catalog in there. So it's not a one-to-one mapping to a folder. It maps to a folder or links to a folder, and then that simply, that library only shows you what is actually a SAS file. Now, a library does not always have to be linked to a folder, and we will see examples of that today. You can link a library to an Excel sheet. You can link a library to a SAS transport file, which is also incredibly useful. And we'll look at examples of that as well. Another reminder, SAS datasets are referred to by a two-level name. So we have library references or library reference dot dataset name. If a library is not specified, the work library is assumed. That is a temporary library. As soon as you end your SAS session, you're going to lose the the files that you stored into the work library. Let's also remind ourselves from episode 2, and please go back and watch it if you have not done so, that libraries cannot have a name longer than 8 characters. So if you get an error in that sense, the SAS log will warn you. But sometimes, you're in the moment, you're programming, you accidentally make it 9 characters instead of 8, and SAS will complain about that. The LIBNAME statement is what we use to create a library or to clear it. It's a global statement, which means if you've got multiple SAS programs in your session, and what do I mean by that? If we've got the SAS Studio interface open and we've got multiple editor windows with multiple programs inside of them, that LIBNAME statement is valid for all of them. That only lasts until you end your session. So if you sign out of SAS Studio, you'll need to map your libraries again. You can also manually clear or change that library reference. So if you've mapped it to, so if we look at the example I've got down here, I've got it as C Jan my data. If I wanted to look at some, let's say it was Bob, if I wanted to map that to C Bob my data, and I run this statement again, and I simply put Bob in there, that will replace that library reference. And so whenever I then refer to this arbitrary name that I've given my lib, that's going to point to C Bob my data from now on. The other thing that we have to keep in mind when working with the libname statement is that there is an optional parameter for the engine, and we'll look at examples of that as well. But these are basically, when we talk about the engine, that's if we want to work, for example, with Excel, or we want to work with SAS transport files. If you leave that out, SAS defaults to what is called V9, and that will simply be then a mapping to a folder on your operating system storage space. I think let's look at an example of that. So this is our SAS Studio interface that we saw last week as well. I've got a program in here, and I've already taken the liberty of creating a folder for us called episode 3. So I'm just going to start off by saving this program and get into the habit of saving as regularly as you can. That's always a good habit to have. You know what, now these two are not the same. That's another learning opportunity for us. We can right click, we can rename, and we can make sure that our files are named consistently. Okay, so let's start by maybe creating a library of our own. Let's by default start with a V9 library, and let's give it an arbitrary name. So I'm going to say, okay, well, libname episode 3. I'm going to start double quotes, and as always the statement ends with a semicolon. Now let's say that I want to map this library episode 3 to this folder here. I need to understand where this folder fits into the file structure of this operating system, and let's remind ourselves again, because we're working with SAS On Demand for academics, there's a lot that's not hidden from us, but that we don't have access to, and it's none of our business because it's not our server. It's not our machine. So what you can do is, if you've managed to navigate to the correct folder here in this server files and folders browser, you can right click on the folder that you want the path of. You can go to properties, and SAS will give you the location. So I'm going to copy and paste that. I hope that's not a confidential information. Let's hope not. If I copy that and paste that, apologies, I need to just get to my keyboard shortcuts. If I copy and paste that in there, that is now the proper path to this folder. Something to keep in mind, so that little dialog box that just popped up is because I used the right click copy and paste methods. Your operating system and your browser might have security settings that don't really want pages to make changes to the clipboard, so you might be forced to just use your keyboard shortcuts, Control C, Control V. If you're on Mac, it's Command C, Command V. I'm actually recording this on a Mac, but I've been using Windows and Linux for most of my life, so I'm having fun with the Mac environment, but I'm not too used to all of the shortcuts and quirks yet. Okay, I'm going to save this program. We have not run this yet, so let's take a look at our libraries, and I'll refresh this here for you. you can see we've got all of our default libraries and some extras like maps and whatnot that came with this installation of SAS. And our work library is empty because we've not put anything in there yet. Apologies. I'm going to run this, and you will note in the log, and the log is very important. We'll always check our log after we ran some section of code. Library reference EP3 was successfully assigned as follows, and even though we did not specify engine v9, you can see that SAS defaulted to it, and it shows us there in the log as well that it definitely assigned it as v9. And there it gives us the physical name as well of the library. So our reference is EP3, and from now on we'll make use of EP3, but just bear in mind that it links in this case to a folder in the operating system environment. If we now look at my libraries, we'll see we have EP3, and let's put something in here just so we demonstrate what is happening. So we know from the work we did last week, if we wanted to output something to EP3, we would say data EP3 dot. I'm going to go back again to the SAS help.fish dataset that we worked with quite a bit last week. And I'm going to just call this one myfish. I'm going to immediately close my data statement with a run statement, because we are civilized SAS programmers, not barbaric ones. And therefore we always close our data and our proc statements with a run. We're going to neatly indent our code to make it more readable. And we're going to point to the SAS help.fish dataset that's available. So let's step through this one more time just to make sure we've got it. We want to output into the EP3 library that we just mapped a dataset called myfish, my_fish, ended with a semicolon. And where is that data coming from? We use a set statement to read in the SAS help.fish library, dataset, the fish dataset from the SAS help library, which we can see here. And let's remind ourselves that the SAS help library is a library full of sample datasets that comes with your SAS installation. I'm going to run this whole thing again. I don't have to. In fact, let's put in use something we learned last week, which is to comment out this libname statement. And you will notice that we don't need to keep mapping this libname statement over and over. It is now a global statement. It will now be here for the entirety of our SAS session until we rename it, replace it, clear it, whatever the case may be. So I'm going to run this program, but only this bit will be executed, and we'll verify this in the SAS log as well. So here in the output data tab, it shows us that we have a table called ep3.my_fish. This looks exactly the same as the SAS help.fish dataset we worked with last week. And if we go and look at the log, you'll notice this bit is commented out. We don't see the bit of output that says, this is the library reference, this is the engine. That's because this statement was never executed. And we do see that we read in 159 observations from SAS help.fish, and we can also see that ep3.my_fish has 159 observations and 7 variables. Perfectly fine. We've basically taken that SAS help.fish dataset and copied it into ep3.myfish. Now, if we open our library state browser here on the left, and we click on EP3, we see that there is a dataset called myfish in there. What is more important to understand here is if we go to server files and folders here on the top, we now see that there is an actual file on the file system called my_fish.sas7bdat. And SAS7bdat is the default, it's the extension for SAS datasets. And SAS7bdat, just to remind you again, is a proprietary standard. In episode 2 as well, we looked at the structure of a SAS dataset. We mentioned there's a descriptor portion that tells SAS how many rows and columns, etc. are in there. And that's what's currently sitting here. So I can even just double click on this item and SAS will open it. And we can verify that it's my_fish.sas7bdat and it's got the same columns and rows as what's in SAS help.fish. But what we've done now is, while we've taken something from SAS help, and even though we've just made a simple copy of it, that has now been preserved and stored onto the file system, and that's what's sitting here. And that's how we can make permanent whatever changes we wanted to affect to a dataset. I hope that is clear. I'm going to put the libname statement back, not because it has to be there, but you usually wouldn't comment it out, so that the next time you open this program, maybe it's something that you're working on over a couple of days, the next time you open this program, you can basically click the run button. And that's kind of what we want to aim for with SAS programs, is that they're self-contained and they're set up in such a way that if somebody new or yourself, maybe you have to come back to it after a couple of months, you should essentially be able to click the run button and it should be able to run without any issues. So I'm putting that statement back. It does no harm to have it there at the top, and even though SAS is going to remap this library every time, it's not that big of a deal. I'm going to take out this bit of code. We don't need to look at that for now, and I'm also going to right click and delete this myfish.sas7bdat file from the storage, because it's just wasting space. It's a pure copy of the SAS help.fish dataset. And if I go to the libraries section and I go to EP3, because that is mapped to that folder, once I remove that file from the file browser, the library that points to that folder also is now missing that dataset. So there is a mapping there, even though it's only for the SAS files in there. Okay, I think we're done with this slide. We've covered how the SAS libraries work and how to assign your own one. We can look at now for using the libname statement for a different engine. Before I do that, it might be worthwhile, and that's something that I forgot about. It might be on one of the following slides, but let's cover it now. And the main thing is, how would you clear a library if you no longer have a need of it? Maybe you've accidentally mapped an extra one, or you've mapped a wrong one that you no longer need, and you just don't want it sitting there in the session and confusing you. One way you could do that is to say libname EP3 and then just leave it blank. That will clear the library. You can also say, I believe it's libname EP3 clear, and that will clear the library as well. So let's run this. Hopefully it doesn't. I've now got two statements that will clear it, so it might error and say there isn't a library that exists with that name. Okay, so that is what has happened. We've assigned a library, then we deassigned it, and then because we issued a statement, these two statements are equivalent. They're going to do the same thing in lines 71 and 72. Because we we cleared it in 71, SAS lost all knowledge and reference to it. And when we try and clear it again in 72, SAS basically says, sorry, nothing like that exists, so I can't deassign something that has not been assigned. And you'll also notice, again, very important, when that warning occurred, we got a little yellow caution sign in our title of the program here. And good programming practice is to make sure that we don't have warnings and we don't have errors in our code. That log should be clean when the program is done. Okay, we know how to assign libraries and we know how to clear them. That is important, I believe, for the SAS exam. As I've said before, if I've got something in these slides, it is most likely important for the SAS exam. And in fact, I may have missed one or two things, which is why it's also important that you reference your SAS base prep guides as well. Now let's go back to our slides. We've mentioned when we started this morning that we can use the LIBNAME statement with a different engine. Now by default, it's V9. It maps to a folder on your disk. We can use the first two bullet points there. There's the XLSX engine for Excel files. And there's also the XPORT engine for SAS transport files. Now those are your files with the .xpt extension. And depending where you work, depending what industry you work in, you might see quite a lot of this in your daily work life. The thing to bear in mind here is that when we map a library to an Excel file or to a SAS transport file, that file essentially becomes the folder. And so I've got an example here with I've got an Excel sheet that I set up as an example that we'll look at. And what happens there is the sheets that are in the Excel file will basically become the datasets that sit there. And if we deal with a SAS transport or .xpt file, we'll have one file with a .xpt extension, but we can put several SAS datasets in there. So we can have one XPT file that has 25 SAS datasets in there. And it's not quite a zip file, but it's probably one of the better ways to explain it is that all these datasets are kind of zipped into an XPT file, although that's not exactly what's happening there. In that same way, the XLSX document with the multiple sheets is sort of the folder or the container for these sheets, and when we map a library to it, we see each sheet as its own individual dataset. So let's do that. I'm going to I set up a Excel file earlier today. If there are spaces in the names of the sheets, you would have to treat it as a name literal. And I'll just point you to the example here below. So this little character, you'll see it in a few of the syntaxes I've set up. That just means space. That's just so that the space is clearly illustrated. So if you have this file that's called stock.xlsx, and note there we imported it with the XLSX engine, then you would read it from this reference, certx1 dot, and then your sheet within this file name is boots boots space stock, close the quote, and n. If you don't have that, you could simply refer to the name of the sheet. So if this was just boots or boot stock one word, you wouldn't have to put these quotes here, and you wouldn't have to put this upper or lowercase n either. I'm going to jump back to SAS Studio, and now there's one more thing that we'll learn about. I'm just going to run this so that it clears this warning because it bugs me. If we right click on episode 3, the folder, there's a very handy thing here called upload files. I'm going to click on that, and it shows us where we're going to upload these files to. So we've already seen that this is the same folder that we've been mapping for our library. I'm going to choose files, and you won't be able to see the dialog box now, but I can see it, and I'm just going to upload this inventory dataset that I set up earlier. So if I click that, notice we've got an XLSX file sitting here. We've mapped this library once again. So if we go and look at our libraries, we can see it there, but notice that it is empty because this is not a valid SAS file. So it'll appear in our file browser, but not in our library browser. Now let's map this Excel file to a library. Now we know how to go about that. We know we're going to start with a LIBNAME statement. Let's call this library something like episode 3 inventory. We don't even have to. Let's just call it inv. We know that it's going to be using the XLSX engine because it is an Excel file that we're referring to. We're going to set up our quotes, end with a semicolon. Now what goes in between here? This is not the folder that the Excel file lives in, but the Excel file itself, because the Excel file is the container for all the sheets that we're going to be treating as datasets. So just to make my own life easier, I'm going to right click on this Excel file. I'm going to go to properties. I'm going to highlight this whole line that's in here, copy it, and then paste it in here. And now I've got two libraries that I'm mapping. I'm mapping episode 3 as a folder, and the engine for this is V9. And I can write this here, but I don't have to, because by default that is assumed. And then I'm also mapping another one called inv for my inventory Excel sheet. So let's run this. I have library EP3 successfully assigned, and I have library INV successfully assigned. Notice the engine here is V9, even though it wasn't specified. The engine here is XLSX because it was specified. And if we go to our libraries browser and we look for it, we'll notice we now have two libraries here. This one being blank because there's no valid SAS files in it. This one is the Excel file, and this Excel file had a sheet called shoes. And we can have a quick look. There's a brand, a price, a quantity, and a type. That's in this in this sheet. So there's 4 columns, and there will be 4 columns in the data set as well. Now we can just quickly look at this by double clicking, and SAS will show us a preview. So we've got types of shoes, sneakers, brands, how many pairs, quantities are there in our inventory, and what is the price of a pair of these. That's all fine and dandy. Let's move this into a spot where we can work with it. So let's say, for example, we want to calculate the value of our inventory for each one of these, and maybe we'll perform a sort as well. Let's do quantity times price, and we'll say that's the value column. I'm going to go back to our program, click on the code portion, and let's, because we're doing temporary work, we'll work within our work library. That's a bit of a tongue twister. So what we'll do is all of our intermediary steps we'll do in the work library, and when we're finally done and we're happy with the data set, we'll move it into that EP3 library that's mapped to the disk. I'll also show you that there's a way of writing back to this Excel file. The one thing that we don't want to do ideally is work with that Excel file live. What do I mean by that? That Excel file is mapped as library INV. We don't want to keep referring to library INV as we write back and forth and make changes. Maybe for the most part that'll work fine, but we have to keep in mind with the way that the PDV works, with the way we can manipulate the program data vector and the output statement, and that's something we'll learn about next week in episode 4. Or maybe later this week if I have the strength to do another episode over the weekend. We might be overwriting things in that Excel file, because that program data vector does a line at a time. If we manipulate the program data vector to say take one line but output 2 or 3 lines from that, we could be overwriting data. So we're going to be reading in this Excel file, taking that shoes data set and working with it in our workspace, and then later we can move it to the EP3 library, and we can maybe move it into the Excel sheet again. So let's start by calculating that value column, because that's what we were hoping to do initially. So I'm going to just say data shoes, close it with a run statement, indent nicely, set inv.shoes. So let's just recap what we're doing, and I apologize if this is a bit long-winded for you, but I want to make sure you understand. Data shoes, which we can see in line 4 above, is essentially work.shoes. So we're telling SAS, you're going to grab data from somewhere and you're going to put it into the work library in a data set called shoes. Where's that data coming from? That data is coming from INV inventory.shoes. What is inventory.shoes? Shoes is a sheet of the Excel file which we have mapped with the XLSX engine to a library called INV. And I'm going to run this once again. And now notice that work.shoes has all of these columns and rows that we saw in our Excel sheet. Sorry. Let us then add the column we were looking for. We said value equals price times quantity, and this is the value of our inventory. If we save and run this again, we have a column here that has the value of each of these. So if we look at the Nike sneakers, for example, now let's take something that's easier to calculate. If we look at the Adidas sneakers, we've got 50 times 100, which is 5,000. So the value of our Adidas sneakers inventory is 5,000, whatever it might be, dollars or whatnot. Let's say we wanted to short this. Let's say we wanted to sort this. Let's sort it descending. And if we look just very quickly at this, we're expecting to see these very fancy stilettos by Monsieur Louboutin at the very top. If you're lucky, maybe you make enough money to afford one of these. If you're luckier than my wife, you have a husband who makes enough money to afford a pair of these for you. But we expect this to be at the very top. So let's do a proc sort. Data equals shoes. let's say for now out equals, and we'll come back to this because there's something I want to do here. Data is shoes and out equals shoes sorted. Close it with a run statement immediately. And what do we want to sort by? By descending value. Now I don't need to do this. I'm just in keeping with the fact that all the other columns have proper case. I'm just starting each one of these with a capital as well, but you don't need to because SAS doesn't care about casing. I'm going to run this. We should now see two tables here. We've got shoes and we've got shoes sorted. And if we click on shoes sorted, we see that these name brand stilettos are now at the top. We've got, for example, these that were the same value. And here's something that we can look at as well. You might remember last week I told you that the PROC sort is a stable sort. So keep in mind Nike is now before Puma, Adidas is before ASICS, and even though they're the same value, we should, if we go back and look at our original data set, we should see Nike before Puma and Adidas before ASICS. So there's Nike before Puma, and there's Adidas before ASICS. And so that just shows again that this is a stable sorting algorithm. So we've got it sorted by descending value. Now let's say we're done. This is all that our boss asked of us. Would be a dream job if this is all you would have to do. But let's say we're done. So this shoes sorted data set we're now done with, and we no longer care about it. However, we need a way of getting this data set to our boss so that he or she can review it. There's a couple of ways we can go about it. We can, for example, do something like this. We can say ep3.shoes sorted. So then proc sort will sort this data set for us by descending value and immediately just export it to the ep3 library, which is mapped here. We could open up Windows Explorer, or we could download it here from SAS Studio, and we could email that to our boss or store it somewhere for him or her. Alternatively, we could write it out to the Excel file again. That could also work, and we could download and email it to our boss. But let's keep it like this for now. And the reason for that is because I want to store it in both. I want to store it in both libraries simultaneously without having to run the proc sort twice. So let's do data ep3.shoes sorted. Let's stick with the same name. Let's not, because I want to make sure you understand that these two are not, it's not just creating a reference, it's copying the whole thing. We're going to run that, and we're going to say set shoes sorted. And then I'm also going to do data inf.shoes_s set shoes_sorted. And so this work.shoes_sorted file that is sitting here is now going to be moved into this library on the disk, and it's also going to be moved into this Excel file as an extra sheet. And so if I run this, and I hope this works, we can see we've got ep3.shoes_s, that's now on the disk, and we've got inv.shoes_s. That's now an extra sheet that's sitting in that Excel file. And if we look at INV, we can see there's 2 here. We can see that this extra value column has been added. And if we look at EP3, we can see that shoes underscore S, the sorted one, is there with the value column also. Now, if we had to get this back to our boss, we could right click on this and we could say download file. We could download it to our local machines, and we could email it to him, or whatever the case may be. Drag and drop it into Teams, and he can quickly look at the value of the inventory. So that's that basically. Let's go back to the slides and resume, because I think the export files. Let's quickly talk about export files as well. So if I wanted to, and we'll stick with this shoes data set that we've got here. If I wanted to put this into a SAS transport file, and the SAS transport file we also discussed last week, it's an open source format. It's readable by SAS, by R, you can use your SAS Universal Viewer, but it's a good way of transporting data while preserving your column types and having it be platform independent, etc., etc. It's a good way of transporting it. So let's call this, I'm going to call it EP3 underscore XPT. We're going to use the export engine, and what I'm going to do here is just copy this, paste it, and I'm going to say XPT. I wonder if it might complain about this file name. I hope not. As long as the data sets that are in the export in the XPT file have names less than 8 characters, it shouldn't complain. So that's also something to keep in mind when you're working with the export files. The data sets in there shouldn't be longer than 8 characters. I think the file name on the disk is allowed to be longer than 8 characters. And we can do the same thing here. So let's start adding some comments, because that's just good practice. Here we will say calculate total value of inventory for each shoe. Sort inventory value descending. These two are for okay, so here we can say export sorted dataset to disk, and this one is export sorted dataset to Excel file. And then let's start a new section here. In this case, it's going to be export unsort. Let's not call it that. Let's call it export original and sorted datasets to XPT. That's our SAS transport file. So we've mapped a library here. We can basically say data ep3 underscore XPT dot choose run, and we can say set. So if we wanted to export the original, yeah, that's that one. So we could point directly to this if we wanted the very original one, but we want the one that has the value column already added. So we'll just say shoes. And then we can add another one that says ep3 underscore xpt dot shoes s, run, and then set shoes sorted. I'm going to run this whole thing. Hopefully I didn't make a mistake somewhere. We've got a bunch of these now because we also have this XPT library that we mapped. And if you look at it within this folder, there's ep3 inventory.xpt. And so this is a single file that now contains both of these datasets in a very structured format, much more so than Excel. Ideally, you don't want to be working with Excel files back and forth. You want it in something that's more structured. Just waiting for the truck to go past. Because this is also mapped in here as a library, you'll be able to go and look at these files as well. Now I'm wondering why there's only one. We'll look at XPT files again. I'm trying to think why there's now only one file in there, not more than one. We might have had to use a PROC copy. I'll get back to that. This is mainly just for quickly understanding how to use the different engines. I'll go and double check why there's only one file in here. I suspect we need to use a PROC copy to get more than one in. Let's not worry too much about that now. That's not too important. I'm just going to take this out as well. Well, that's it. So we've learned the basics of the XLSX and the export engines. Let's move on. We have already covered this, so if you want to get rid of a library reference, you could either issue it with a blank here, or you could issue it with a clear statement. Excuse me. You'll also note I said here using libraries with a SAS7B, that file is very easy. This is not always the case. So in the real world, you might have people sending you data that's in Excel format or in CSV format, or you sometimes get the strangest requests from clients. Maybe something is delimited with tabs, or I think the strangest request I ever got was, I think they had data in a Word file or something. They had concentrations, plasma concentrations in a Word document, and then I can't remember exactly how we managed to import that Word document and work with that data. But you get some absolutely bizarre requests from clients sometimes, and data is not always clean. But if you're lucky, if you work in a large enough company, you might have data entry assistants that will take things either from paper or some other format and structure the data for you. You might have an electronic data capture system that from the start will move data, instead of on paper and whatnot, it will put it straight into an electronic format. It often has a couple of basic error checks, so that so let's use an example from the healthcare or the pharmaceutical sector where I work. If the nurse is maybe trying to record the vital signs of a patient, so that's something like your blood pressure, your heart rate, your weight, your height, and if she tries to enter this into the electronic data capture tool, but she accidentally selects tomorrow's date and she's doing it right now, it might say, listen, you've just a warning, you've got this for a future date, is this correct or not? And so stuff like that helps to minimize errors for people who work with the data further down the line. And episode 4, we're going to see how to work with files that are no longer, SAS7B dat and not just in the SAS help library. So we've started a bit with that today with the Excel file, but honestly, having this LIBNAME statement and the XLSX engine is again very, very easy. And real life doesn't always work like that. The other thing just to keep in mind is that this XLSX engine, to my knowledge, and I stand to be corrected on this, but to my knowledge is not part of the default SAS base package. So if you want to be able to use that XLSX engine, I think you need to buy a license for that. And so it could also be that your company simply doesn't have the license, and then instead of having the luxury of just quickly doing a library reference to it, you'll have to use a PROC import, which we're looking at next week. But just keep that in mind. Okay, so we've learned about a couple of procs by now. We've done proc sort. Did we do another proc? I thought we did. But we're gonna add one more to our repertoire today, which is the PROC contents proc. And this is very useful for learning more about your dataset, or if you've got a whole library of datasets, you can learn some more about all the datasets in that library. So let's look at some examples we've got here. We've got PROC contents data equals mylib._all_. This is a special keyword, so this is basically telling SAS that it's all the datasets in mylib. This no DS, no datasets, is an option to give you to suppress information about the individual datasets, and you just basically want information about your library. We've also got, if we want to just get some information about one dataset, we can just pass a single reference to it. We'll take a look at this varnum keyword as well. Let's jump back to SAS Studio and start getting into that sort of thing. So let's see what we've got. Let's work with EP3 for now, I think. I think so. The only other thing I might do is just put this file in EP3 as well. So let's export it as well. And you'll see why in a minute. Nope, not data. ep3.choose run set choose. Okay, so let me run this and just make sure it works. I'm just going to start taking some stuff out here. So the bit that exports to the Excel file, we're not too worried about that. I'm going to take that out. And if we look in the EP3 library, we've got shoes and shoes_s. Now, let's start a PROC contents example. Now you'll notice I want you to compare, as I'm writing the code for PROC contents, compare it with the code for PROC sort, and start to notice the very, very subtle and intriguing pattern. Let's do shoes first, and then we'll run it. So ep3.choose. We can do the one in the work library as well. It will give us the same information because they're copies of one another. But let's run this specifically. And now note all of the information that the contents procedure is giving us. It tells us what we're looking at, how many observations rows it has, how many variables columns it had, is there indexes on this data set, compressed, sorted, whatnot, what engine it was done with, when was it created, when was it modified, what is the data representation. We can see it's a 64-bit Linux system. What's the encoding on the dataset? Is it UTF-8? Is it Latin encoding? Etc. So there's a whole lot of information about the engine and the host and everything else that we're not too worried about. We can get a alphabetic list of variables and attributes as well. This can also be quite useful because sometimes you may want to know what columns are in your data set programmatically. Maybe you're searching for a column, maybe you're searching for a specific label, and you could use this proc contents procedure to go looking for something that even if you don't quite know where it's supposed to be. We've got the types. Recall again that we've got only two types in SAS. Something is either character or numeric. We can see some lengths here that have been assigned. So that's a lot of information about this one specific data set. Now, what if I wanted to have this information not just printed out in the results tab, but in a data set itself? I can simply say output it to a data set. And now let's compare this again. Proc sort, data equals, out equals. Proc contents, data equals, out equals. So we're starting to learn how SAS expects us to pass this information as well. If I run this, I've still got the information here in the results tab, but if I click on output data, there's now also a shoes underscore contents table that's sitting there. I'm just going to select all here. Now this is extremely useful because we get to see libname, what library is this data coming from, memname, that's the name of the data set. We did not put a label on our data set. We've got the names of the variables. These are sorted alphabetically. What type are they? So 2 is your character, 1 is numeric. What length is your variable? This varnum is what is the order in which they were created. You know, in the if you open that data set. So type is number 1, that's your first column. Brand is number 2, that's your second column. 3, 4, 5, so on. What formats are applied on these columns? There's a ton of information that's given in here. That's very, very useful. If we wanted, we could do the whole EP3 library. So we could say proc contents data equals ep3 dot underscore all, run, and let's see what that gives us. So now it looks a little different. We've still got the contents procedure, we've still got the EP3 library and the V9 engine, that's all the same. However, it's telling us there's two data sets in here. There's shoes and there's shoes underscore s. It is giving us, firstly, the information about ep3.shoes. And there's all of our columns as we expect them. And then it's also giving us the information about ep3 shoes underscore s. And it's got the same number of columns, except we know we've sorted this by descending value. So if we only wanted to have this bit of information without the individual dataset information, we would simply pass the no ds, no dataset keyword, and we would only get information about the folder. About the library. Which folder is it mapped to, what engine, and what datasets are sitting within this folder without going into details. Same for this one above. Recall from the slides they mentioned I mentioned the varnum keyword because I set up the slides. If we run this, instead of having 5, 3, 2, 4, 1, whatever, we'll actually see those variables in the order that they were created. So there's our varnum, type, brand, quantity, price, value, and that's the same order that we would see if we actually opened the shoes dataset. That's the proc contents procedure. Very useful. It becomes more useful the more you start working with your metadata. So once you get to the point where you're starting to look for a certain variable name, a certain variable label, types, formats, all that sort of thing, then it becomes very useful. If you're still trying to, find your way around SAS and just adding columns and outputting data, you're not going to worry too much about this, but keep it in mind. The more you try and automate stuff, the more useful something like PROC contents will become later down the line. Okay, I think we covered everything in here. Let's do a exercise. So this is very simple. We're going to create a library. We're going to call it mylib in any directory of your choice. Just make sure you have right access to that directory. We're going to move the SAS help and SAS help.cars and SAS help.fish datasets into this, and we're going to do so programmatically. We already know how to do that. And then we're going to just use PROC contents. I might actually just leave this as homework because we've done all of this already. You can see here, for example, the instruction is columns should be in the creation order. We've just looked at that. That means that it should be according to the order in which, if you were to double click on that dataset, in the order in which they would be displayed. There's also running PROC contents with and without Node.js and comparing the output. We've done that. I think I might just leave this entire exercise as homework because I think this video is a bit on the longer side and longer than I had intended. And we've basically covered all of this already throughout this session. So I'm going to leave this as homework. Pause the video here, try and do this for yourself. But there should be nothing in here that we didn't cover during the video today. And then that about wraps it up for today. On the next episode, we are going to have a bit more work. The next episode is going to be a doozy. You can see that I put in as well, the party is at an end. We've had it very easy up until now. Now we're going to do the tough bits, which is working with plain text files and delimited files and that sort of thing. How do we import an Excel file if for example, we don't have that XLSX engine available to us, to make it easy. Don't let me scare you too much. It's basically just different variations of the PROC import procedure. We're going to learn about the file name statement. That basically just creates the same way that a libname creates a reference to a folder. The file name statement will create a reference to a file, like a CSV file or a .dat file or an Excel file. PROC import is for importing data. We've worked with data steps and set statements this episode, last episode. We even briefly looked at it in episode 1. So we should be fairly comfortable with that by now. We're going to look at the where statement, which is for filtering data. If you're coming from R, that's very similar to the dplyr filter function. There's some things to keep in mind when we work with the where statement, but it's not too difficult in and of itself. And then we're going to look at something interesting called the output statement, and we're going to learn more about the ways that SAS works in the background. We're going to see that an output statement is always there. We're going to see that we can take control of that output statement, and at some point when we're going to talk about the program data vector, the PDV again, around episode, I think it's either episode 6 or episode 7, we're going to see how we can manipulate the program data vector as well with an output statement. So I'll go a bit above and beyond in that episode so that you can understand the power of the PDV. But for now, we've really got a lot of stuff in the next episode that we're going to be working on. So get yourself ready for that. That's it for today. Thank you very much for watching. If you've stuck with me through the rambling and the waffling, I appreciate it. Feel free to leave a comment. You can like and subscribe if you want to. As always, the content is free, so no obligation there. And then I will see you either later this week or sometime next week for episode 4. Thanks all. Cheers. Bye bye.